Welcome to the very first episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. I am your host, Kyle Anzalone, and here we are going to give my take on the most important events happening in the world. And we have some huge stories to get started with here on the show. The first story, of course, is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is now facing arrest warrants from the ICC. Also, we have to talk about what's going on in Ukraine and if that war could possibly turn nuclear. So let's start off today by talking about Netanyahu and what kind of trouble he now faces himself in with the ICC issuing arrest warrants for him and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who was fired by Netanyahu last month. So these arrest warrants have been 6 months in the making. It was 6 months ago that the ICC's top prosecutor, Karim Khan, sought the arrest warrants for the two top Israeli officials for what Israel has done in Gaza over the past year and a month now. Just a relentless onslaught. They've deprived the people of aid. They've killed civilians. They bombed all the civilian targets, destroyed the hospitals. It's been just an absolute nightmare and an absolute massacre. And for the first time, it seems some international body that has some little bit of authority is now doing something about it. So we do have a little bit of good news here. Now, the question is, will there actually be justice here? I doubt that Netanyahu ends up at The Hague and serving time in jail there. However, Netanyahu is also facing corruption charges and potential jail time at home. And so this really would dwindle down the number of countries that he could flee to really just the United States if he ends up facing charges both in Israel and the ICC. So he may end up in jail somewhere related to these charges. I think the more important point, and particularly as an American, what I see as the most important point here is the implications this has for American politics. If Netanyahu, Joe Biden's friend, he would say, my friend Bibi, I'm going to Israel as a Zionist. I'm here to greet my good friend Benjamin Netanyahu, who I have known for decades. These are things we heard from Biden and other top administration officials for months and months and months now. Well, Joe Biden, your good friend, is now facing charges from the International Criminal Court. This is huge. He is a war criminal. Now let's talk about some of those charges, but first, let's play the first clip we have on today's show. That is Netanyahu addressing the American Congress over the summer about the potential arrest warrant he was facing at the ICC.
I want to thank all of you here today who forcefully opposed the false accusations of the ICC and stood up for the truth. These lies are not only libelous, they're downright dangerous. The ICC is trying to shackle Israel's hands and prevent us from defending ourselves. And if Israel's hands are tied, America is next. And I'll tell you what else is next. The ability of all democracies to fight terrorism will be imperiled. That's what's on the line. So let me assure you, the hands of the Jewish state will never be shackled. Israel will always defend itself.
Now, in that clip, Netanyahu claims that the claims made by Karim Khan in his ICC indictment are libelous. They're lies. Well, what did Khan claim? He claimed that the Israelis were targeting civilians and depriving the people of Gaza of aid. And it's been very obvious over the past year that the Israelis are absolutely intentionally targeting civilians. We've had tons of residential structures blown up months ago. 6 months ago, The Guardian reported that 50% of homes in Gaza were damaged or destroyed, and they made these calculations by looking at satellite data of the Gaza Strip. If you look at the destruction of the hospitals, the schools, the shelters, we've seen bombing after bombing. You see kids in the courtyard of a school playing soccer as Israeli bombs rain down on top of them. And so just from the anecdotal evidence, the little videos that are able to get out of Gaza absolutely show that Netanyahu and the Israelis are targeting civilians. We also get it directly from the Israeli soldiers themselves. Recently, there was a funeral for an Israeli soldier who was killed in Lebanon. And at the funeral, members of his military unit and members of his family discussed how he talked about killing his Palestinian children in Gaza. We've seen video after video posted online by Israeli soldiers discussing how they randomly fire into Palestinian houses. And we also had the reporting from Israeli sources, including 972 magazine, about AI programs such as Lavender and the Gospel, where they generated targets with almost no human oversight whatsoever and just rained down bombs all over the Gaza Strip. And so a lot of people in Gaza were needlessly killed by the Israeli bombing attacks, and this was a really big deal. Now, the other, and almost really the more significant, as many people as Israel is killing right now with their bombs and bullets, when you look at the long term, what's going to have the more devastating impact and what's probably going to kill more people in Gaza is going to be the starvation siege, the banning of water from entering Gaza, the prevention of medical aid from entering the Strip. And so Israel has been doing this for months and months and months. In fact, on October 7th, right after the Hamas attack, then Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced that it was Israeli policy not to let any food, water, or medicine or other aid enter the Gaza Strip. Now, because of pressure from Israel's biggest backer, the U.S., they've let in a trickle of aid throughout the war, but since the start of October, it has really been clamped down almost entirely, particularly in northern Gaza, where 3 cities are facing an absolute siege and no aid has reached them at all. So Netanyahu, in his speech, is going to get up there and claim to the American people, the American Congress, that, look, we're allowing the aid in, and it's the Palestinians that are stealing the aid. And so can we play the second clip we have of Netanyahu where he's talking to Congress about the aid getting into Gaza?
If there are Palestinians in Gaza who aren't getting enough food, it's not because Israel is blocking it, it's because Hamas is stealing it.
Those clips always disgust me, how our congressmen just jump up like trained seals and clap for Netanyahu after almost every sentence he made. That speech was absolutely painful to watch just because the Congress kept clapping almost as long as Netanyahu was talking, probably because a lot of them are there from AIPAC money, and so they're essentially paid to stand there and clap for Netanyahu. But the reason why that lie is so important is one of the things that really upsets Americans is children starving to death and finding out that children are undergoing amputations without anesthesia. And that's happening because Israel isn't laying enough aid into Gaza. However, just like everything else that happens in Gaza, Netanyahu shifts the blame to Hamas. So whenever a bomb hits a hospital, oh, that was a Hamas command and control center. Hamas is using the civilians as human shields. It's their fault. Whenever aid doesn't get into Gaza, the Israelis say, oh, it's because Hamas is stealing that aid. But we now know that that is untrue. There is this really not really great article because it comes 13 months too late, but important reporting from the Washington Post, where they get into and they look at what the Israelis have done in Gaza. The article is titled "Gangs Looting Gaza Aid Operate in Areas Under Israeli Control." And the aid groups told the Washington Post that an internal United Nations memo obtained by the Washington Post concluded last month that the gangs may be benefiting from a passive, if not active, benevolence or protection from the Israeli Defense Forces. One gang leader, the memo said, established a military-like compound in an area restricted, controlled, and patrolled by the IDF. And so it's not Hamas who is stealing this aid. Rather, it is the Israelis who are allowing criminal gangs in Gaza to steal the aid. Now, the Israelis have achieved this with through several policies. One, Gaza previously had a police force. Now, as Hamas was the political entity, also the military entity that controlled Gaza, that police force was controlled by Hamas, and the Israelis targeted that police force even when they were protecting aid convoys. And so by disbanding the existing police force, the aid convoys were then vulnerable to attack. Then the Israelis allowed these gangs to prop up in areas controlled by the IDF, and they started looting aid convoys. The most significant one of these looting events happened earlier this week when about 100 of 110 aid trucks that entered in one convoy were looted. Now, you instantly have one of the, I would say, least intelligent American politicians, John Fetterman, immediately taking to Twitter to claim the truth in Gaza. Hamas steals aid and then sells it to their own people, yet Israel faces blood libel with committing genocide or starving Gaza. I stand with the truth, and he has a little Israel flag at the end of it. Now, what Fetterman apparently didn't take the time to look at and read in the article he linked to was it wasn't Hamas, it was gangs that stole the aid. And what we later found out from the Israeli outlet Haaretz was, in fact, Hamas actually intervened in that and killed 20 of the people who stole the aid and then went on to return the aid. And so it's not that the people of Gaza are suffering and are not eating because of Hamas, but rather it's clearly from Israel in the actions that they are undertaking. And so, some people may ask, why would Israel even allow in the aid in the first place? Why not just restrict it as they've done it in several areas? And I think a part of it is propaganda. Being able to say 109 aid trucks entered Gaza makes it sound like the Israelis are doing something and taking a step in the right direction. Additionally, this is something that sows chaos and divisions within the Palestinians. And so now not only do you have Hamas fighting against the IDF, you also have Hamas fighting against this local gang, and I'm sure that exposes them to operations from the IDF. And so this local gang is essentially being used as a proxy force. And of course, all this is a part of the general's plan. The reason they're trying to deprive the Palestinian people of aid is they have a two-pronged attack. One is the military exercises. They destroy everything. In fact, right now, Israeli troops are looting and vandalizing the only desalinization plant. So a plant that cleans seawater and makes it into drinkable water. That is being destroyed and looted by the Israeli forces in northern Gaza. They've bombed everything. They're destroying hospitals. Just before we went live recording this show, the chief doctor at the Kamal Awad Hospital in northern Gaza said the hospital is actively being bombed and they are once again under siege. And so they're destroying all the civilian infrastructure, but then they're also not allowing food and other aid into Gaza. And so as what is laid out in the ICC indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu, that there are actually children in Gaza who have had to undergo amputations without anesthesia because of the Israeli restrictions on medicine entering the Gaza Strip. So moving on, we have to talk about the situation unfolding in Ukraine, where on Sunday, the White House apparently signed off on Ukraine using ATACMS, which are long-range U.S. missiles, a range of 190 miles, to hit targets deep inside Russian territory. Previously, the White House had refused to allow this because Russia made explicit threats that doing so would invoke and would activate their new nuclear doctrine, which would allow Russia to carry out all kinds of attacks, including using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So let's get into what's happened so far. The first round of attacks was carried out against Russian targets in a region neighboring Kursk. And so this is where Ukrainian forces have already pushed into and taken some territory in Russia. Now, they've been largely driven out of that area, but the U.S. had previously authorized Ukraine to carry out attacks on military facilities that were aiding the fight in Kursk. And so I think this attack is somewhat in line with the old policy, although it is much deeper into Russian territory, and it uses the attack on missiles, which Russia has been very explicit about is going to be a major provocation. The attacks, these particular attacks were carried out about 100 kilometers from the Russian border. 6 ATACMS were fired in all. Russia said that 5 of those were successfully intercepted, with 1 being damaged as it was hit. That later crashed, started a fire. Apparently, that fire was close enough to the arms depot being targeted that it caused some secondary explosions to break out. So Why would Biden do this? Why would Biden, in his lame duck period, after the American people just went to the ballot box and they voted for Donald Trump? And one of the key differences between President-elect Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris was the policy on Ukraine, where Trump very explicitly, and while it may be fanciful to believe that Donald Trump is actually going to be able to end the war in Ukraine on day one, the fact that he wanted to end the war at all was a huge diversion of policy from Kamala Harris, who wanted to keep the proxy war going essentially forever, as far as we know. And so the question is, why would Biden do this, take this major escalation after the American people had just rejected this policy? Well, let's go to a clip of Jade Sullivan to talk about it, and we'll kind of break it down from there.
We've provided the tanks, we provided the F-16s, we provided the HIMARS, we provided the Patriots, we provided many of the things that you said earlier we wouldn't provide. And it's not back then, it's rather today that Ukraine finds itself in a more challenged position on the battlefield, suggesting that there's not a straight line between those weapon systems and how it does on the battlefield. Where is the straightest line between Ukrainian performance and inputs? It's on mobilization of manpower.
So from that clip right there, Sullivan makes a key admission in that the Ukrainians are struggling now more than they have been before. And before, earlier in the war, they were able to retake some Ukrainian territory, but since then we've given them Abrams tanks, attack on longer range missiles, F-16s, Patriot systems, and Sullivan's curious as to why this hasn't made a difference. Now he goes to its mobilization, and we'll get to that piece in a minute, because this is a very sadistic thing to continue to send the Ukrainians into a meat grinder for a war that can't be won. But let's talk about some other things that he says there. He says, we've given them all these weapon systems and it hasn't made a difference. It hasn't improved the Ukrainian situation on the battlefield. This is true. It's made the Ukrainian situation on the battlefield worse. Why has it done that? Because it's provoked Russia to escalate the war each and every time. Russia has said, in the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, made very clear early on in the war, and has said it time and time again, that the more advanced weapon systems that the U.S. gives to Kiev, the longer range weapon systems that the U.S. gives to Kiev, the more Ukrainian territory that Russia will need to take to feel secure from the Ukrainians. And so, with that in mind, every single U.S. escalation in the proxy war is going to be met with a greater escalation from Russia, and that's what we've seen time and time again. Now the Ukrainians are in real trouble, and that's the last piece of kind of what Sullivan is talking about here. They need more men. And they really want to keep this war going at least through the election. And they probably really want a decent interval, right? They don't want this thing completely falling apart on January 21st. They want at least several months. That way they could really place the blame for the Ukrainians losing this war on Donald Trump rather than on Joe Biden. And so they want this war to continue for an extended period of time beyond Biden leaving office and Trump taking office. And to do that, when they don't have manpower, they're going to do things like authorize deeper strikes into Russia, hoping that at least causes the Kremlin to have to reorient some of their positions. Maybe they have to move some staging areas further away from the front lines to calculate for the fact that Ukraine can now fire these ATACMS 190 miles into Russian territory. Now, in addition to the ATACMS missiles, this is Thursday, November 21st, we also have the UK signing off on the Storm Shadow. These are cruise missiles, slightly shorter range, 155 miles, and those have also been fired. A barrage of them were also fired into Russia, apparently some of them landing in a residential neighborhood. So these are major, major escalations going on that are going to provoke Russia to escalate this war significantly. So while the American and British long-range missiles striking Russia have been major stories that need to be discussed, leading to major provocations, one story that hasn't gotten as much attention that I think is almost as important is this new think tank report that was produced by an Ukrainian who is very close to the Ukrainian government. This is Zelenskyy, and he is the head of the Department of Ukraine's National Institute for Strategic Studies, a government research center. And this report was compiled and commissioned by a think tank controlled by the Ukrainian defense industry and was presented to Ukrainian defense ministers. So understand that while this may not be an official report, it is commissioned by the Ukrainian government, and this is a narrative that the Ukrainians want out there. And the paper is either a threat to Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin, but the paper says that Ukraine should develop a nuclear weapon. This is going to be seen as extremely provocative in Moscow. And one of the statements that Yitzhak made to the Times was, "I was surprised by the reverence the United States has for Russia's nuclear threat. It may have cost us the war. They want to treat nuclear weapons as some kind of god, so perhaps it's time for us to also pray to that god." The Ukrainians playing to the god of nuclear weapons is certainly something that is going to provoke Vladimir Putin and make him think that he needs to have his finger very close to the Russian nuclear button. So we have a lot more we could talk about. Of course, there was a reported intercontinental ballistic missile attack from Russia on Ukraine. Could that be a part of all of the response? That'll be on the next episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. Please subscribe and tune in.